Let's talk about a recent report that talks about the Department of Justice and Black Lives Matter. There was a study that was called, a report was called Struggle for Power, the Ongoing Prosecution of Black Movement. It finds the Justice Department deliberately targeted supporters of Black Lives Matter movement. How did they do so? Our next guest is the Policy and Research Coordinator for the Movement for Black Lives, Dr. Amara Enyia. Glad to have you on Roland Unfiltered. How you doing?
I'm good. Glad to be here.
So break this down for us. Exactly how were leaders deliberately targeted by the Justice Department?
Sure. So this study was conducted by the Movement for Black Lives in partnership with the City University of New York Law School, the CLEAR Clinic, and it was designed to really understand how the federal government charged or got involved in the prosecution of individuals who were involved in the uprisings in 2020. The report covers the time period of August 31st, 2020 to October 25th, 2020, October of last year. And it looks at the charges that were brought to individuals in 326 cases. And it shows quite clearly how the federal government overreached in an attempt to federalize charges against those who are involved in protests. It also really shines a light on the historic role that the federal government has played in attempting to interfere with the rights, particularly of Black people, to express their displeasure, to protest, and to essentially to exercise their First Amendment rights. And so this report, again, done with the Creating Law Enforcement Accountability and Responsibility Clinic out of the City University of New York and the Movement for Black Lives, really speaks to a historic practice of the federal government as it relates to Black people actually exercising their First Amendment rights.
And so the implications of this. Now, obviously, what was the span of this study? What years did it cover?
So the report actually covers the months between August 31st of last year and October 25th of last year. And it looks at 326 cases in which we found some pretty startling facts. And so the implications of the report, for example, are that in about 92%, almost 93% of those cases, the federal government attempted to upcharge. So essentially to charge at a higher rate or a higher level than those same infractions would be at the state or local level. So it shows a clear overreach of the government, and the implications are significant. One is that when in federal cases, for example, individuals are required to serve 85% of their time. In federal cases, they are placed in prisons that are much more distant. They also, in many of these cases, they require mandatory minimums. And so when we think about the impact of mass incarceration on Black people and look at the right to protest being infringed upon by attempts to criminalize protest, including such measures as mandatory minimum sentencing, harsher penalties, and the disparity that we've seen in the report in terms of who was actually arrested and who was charged. The report outlines that in the majority of cases, Black people were targeted. We found that in the cases where the demographic data was collected, 52% of those were Black, and 91% of those Black people that were targeted were Black males.
All right, then. Questions from our panel. I'll start with Jason first.
So, excuse me. First of all, this seems like really, really incredible work. I'm wondering exactly where you think we should go in order to reform our justice system broadly, and how your research can help in terms of trying to make broader reforms in the justice system.
Sure. So the Movement for Black Lives has really taken the approach of proposing legislation called the Breathe Act that actually does just that. It takes an approach of actually investing in our communities and divesting from the carceral state, which is police and prisons, because we know about the harm that has been done to our communities through mass incarceration, through mandatory minimum sentencing, through the disparities in the criminal legal system. So these are all based on fact. So we've proposed this federal legislation parts of it are actually being carried by members of Congress at this time. We believe that we cannot do the same things that we've been doing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. And so what this report shows is that when it comes to Black people expressing their First Amendment rights, and really as of last year coming out because of the murder of George Floyd and in large numbers, that the federal government stepped in ways that they do not typically do to make sure that people that were involved, and especially Black people involved in these uprisings, are getting charged federally, are getting harsher sentences, and they're not treating white people that were involved in protests the same way. And so we're seeing that disparity play out, even in the language that's being used. I mean, we could all remember words like thugs being thrown around, and they're members of Antifa, et cetera. And yet, for white individuals that were involved in the insurgency on January 6th, they were called very fine people. We know that the federal government uses language and propaganda to demonize Black people, and they've done so historically. We can go back to the time of J. Edgar Hoover. We can go back to 1919 and the language that was used that led to Red Summer in 1919. We can go back to COINTELPRO, which actually uses language, the Joint Terrorism Task Force uses language that's eerily similar to COINTELPRO, which was used to attempt to dismantle what they called Black radicals, like the Black Panther Party, the Nation of Islam, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The government has historically been involved in these efforts to curtail protest, and they've used the legal system to do just that.
Kelly.
Hi. Just for clarification, given basically the harassment that this movement has endured, are there any civil suits or even criminal suits if the harassment calls for it that you plan on filing or bringing charges against those who file these frivolous suits against you?
Yeah, so one of the biggest calls that the Movement for Black Lives is making is for amnesty for anyone, any individuals who were prosecuted during that time frame. I mean, that's one of the first things that needs to happen is amnesty. And we know that there have been individual cases where they are attempting to push back against these charges. But we also know that at the federal level, that's more difficult than at the state and local level. And so there's some intention behind the federal government stepping in, even over and above what state and local entities in the criminal legal system will do. And so there are individual cases that are pushing back. We have really been trying to raise awareness of this issue because not only is it a violation of First Amendment rights, but it's being done in conjunction with these attempts at voter legislation. When you criminalize protest, it means that individuals who will face harsher sentences. It contributes to mass incarceration. So we actually have to raise awareness about this issue and about the federal government's overreach so that people understand that taken together with the onslaught of voter suppression legislation, with the onslaught of legislation across the country to criminalize protests, these are things that are done to curtail Black people actually calling out systems of oppression and holding and attempting to hold the government, to hold these systems accountable for their unjust behavior and unjust actions.
Brittany?
Yeah, so, based on everything that you said in the report, I start to get nervous about new legislation for the purpose of domestic terrorism. I feel like the reason why so many legislators in the Biden administration is having this conversation is because of what we saw on January 6th. However, I'm curious to know what you think and if that is going to affect our community, especially when we know we have outright white supremacists in local government, FBI, military, state and local police. So do you agree with this new push to quell domestic terrorism and white supremacy, or do you think it's actually going to harm Black activists?
Well, yeah, we know that this push is going to disproportionately harm Black activists because that has been the pattern historically. So again, for example, you can look at the Joint Terrorism Task Force that was formed. We can look at what happened in 2017, where this new term, Black identity extremist, came out of the FBI for the purposes of actually targeting Black people who are engaged in work to address systemic racism and oppression. And so it is very concerning because we know that there is a disparity in how the legislation can be used. So if you do have a task force like the Joint Terrorism Task Force that was formed to address groups like Al-Qaeda and terrorist threats, and then they have created a focus where, okay, now we're going to also throw in these so-called Black identity extremists so that the federal government has the ability to increase surveillance, to increase punishments, and to increase essentially harm for things that will curtail the people's desire to protest. It's done to dissuade protest, and it's also done to instill a level of fear because you don't want to, if you express your protest or if you engage in protest, that you'll be prosecuted, you'll be arrested, you'll have federal charges. So this is the concern. I mean, and we see this pattern happen throughout history. So for example, this increased surveillance of the Black Panther Party. I mean, we know that there's a collaboration between the FBI, the local police department in Chicago, to actually ensure that damage was done to the Black Panther Party by using the state, using the federal government to increase surveillance. And we're seeing that same pattern playing out right here, creating new language so that you can then have justification to use the heavy hand of the state to overreach and to dissuade Black people in particular from expressing their First Amendment rights and speaking out against oppression.
All right. Well, we certainly appreciate it. Certainly great work with this, and hopefully with a new administration, there will be a much different attitude from the Department of Justice, because we certainly know how thuggish the last one was.
Precisely.
Folks, back to our Roland Martin Unfiltered video in just one moment.
Football bans and one of the best fan experiences in the country. The Cricket BX SWAC Challenge kickoff returns to Atlanta on August 28th, along with special guests, College Game Day. Then Alcorn State takes on North Carolina Central with conference bragging rights on the line. Center Park Stadium is the place to be on August 28th. Come tailgate all day before enjoying a primetime matchup on the gridiron. You don't want to miss this. Check out MEACSWACChallenge.com for more information.
Don't forget, folks, Roland Martin Unfiltered is going to be broadcasting live from Atlanta on Friday and Saturday. Friday will be at the Atlanta Braves Stadium, talking to the presidents of both universities, as well as officials with the SWAC and MEAC. Then on Saturday, we'll be at the Coca-Cola Fan Zone, broadcasting live from that particular afternoon. And then, of course, we'll be live streaming the halftime show and the concert taking place after the game. You can watch it at 7 p.m. Eastern on ESPN. And we appreciate it, in partnership with Coca-Cola, of making this happen. See you next week.